I think that that's the extraordinary thing about the way that I've seen God transformatively move in my life. It's not about me having it all together. It's not about me doing the right things. There's this beauty of encounter where, the special moments of encountering Jesus often happen in the difficult, dark, hard seasons. I think it's really beautiful to have this idea that actually the invitation to someone to Christian community is often you belong before you behave.
Why are you so passionate about people understanding this grace that Jesus gives people and breathes into people in perhaps the worst seasons of their life where they've messed up or even where they are a victim of a horrendous act? Why is this so important for people to understand?
Hey there, and welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm your host, Caleb, and I'm so glad that you've joined with us here today. If you're a regular friend of the show, well, welcome back. You know what to expect. For those who don't, this is a podcast where we have gospel-centered conversations with people who love Jesus and basically explore and hear some stories on how Christians engage within this current cultural moment. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channels or follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. With that said, I'm so excited for you guys to hear this conversation. So let's jump into it together.
All right, well, I'm joined here with Duncan Robinson. Welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. How are you going?
Caleb, doing really well, mate. Good to be here today. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fairly well. It's morning on my side, and I sort of face a window, and the sun is like beating down very, very harshly. So I'm just feeling like a radiation of the heat through the blinds. But besides that, yeah, fairly good. For our listeners who are new to the show or have joined come on board over the past year, they won't know who you are, but I had a conversation with you probably about a year or a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
You had a podcast called the Dead Elephants podcast, and we sort of did a joint venture for an episode, which was a load of fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation, but maybe to give some context, you're the lead pastor of Northgate Church. If I remember correctly from our last conversation, an interesting piece about yourself is you have a black belt in jiu-jitsu.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu, yes.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Is there a difference between regular jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or just?
There is. So there is a form called Japanese jiu-jitsu, but the best way I kind of explain it, if you're familiar with the UFC or mixed martial arts, is oftentimes when it goes to the mat and they start cuddling and everyone gets really bored with the fight. That's what I learn, and I do that in pajamas, which makes it even slower and more cuddly. So every time they're like, stand up and strike, I'm like, no, go to the ground and cuddle. That's the stuff that I do. So
okay, it's all making sense now. I've seen a few reels and memes lately of people who do jiu-jitsu and explained it exactly like that. They're sort of like someone's attacking them or an intruder's broken into their house and they're just on the floor scooting along.
Butt scooting,
like,
yeah.
Yeah.
You've nailed it, mate.
Come to the... Oh, that's brilliant. Well,
there's a scene out of The Simpsons where there's a guy who falls on his back and he says, fall into my guard and meet your doom. And I laugh at that because I'm like, every jiu-jitsu person's like that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, very honored to have the Australian Joe Rogan on the podcast.
Appreciate that.
But maybe you can add some flesh to who you are as well. So maybe, yeah, tell us about what does your week look like, and yeah, what are some things that you're interested in at the moment?
Okay, yeah. So, well, quick history. I was on breakfast radio in Sydney here on a radio station called Hope 103.2. And I think that's very similar to Sunshine FM. So if, back in my day, there was a guy called Morrow, there was Kirst, they were on Sunshine, they were friends with mine. And then in Melbourne.
Friends with Morrow.
Yeah.
Love the guy.
He's such a great guy. And then out of Melbourne, there's a crew called Light FM. And so friends with Kel and Lucy down there. Moved back from breakfast radio into pastoral ministry, where I've been the senior pastor at Northgate for a little over 5 years now, and then various kind of different iterations on team there for at least the last 10 years. And then I do that a couple of 4 days a week. And then I have a day a week where I do like creative communications consultancy and a whole bunch of master classes on saying it simply. And then coach jiu-jitsu a couple of nights a week at a gym called Modern Combat. And then write books. I did a podcast with another fellow guest on your show, Chris, and we had that podcast obviously called Upside Down Elephants. Sorry, no, I say Upside Down Elephants. That's a combination of what we did. Dead elephants.
Amalgamation.
Yeah, maybe that's what we should do next. Upside Down Elephants.
Yeah, I'm in.
Yeah. So do a bunch of stuff, and then obviously I've got a brand new book out, which is one of the reasons I think I'm here, called Full Phoenix Rising, and so which is about real time grace at the speed of Jesus. So that's who I am, mate.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you did that smooth segue into your book yourself, because it is why I want to have a conversation with you to see what you unpack in your book, Full Phoenix Rising. So I suppose the first question off the bat regarding that is, why did you call it Full Phoenix Rising?
So, funnily enough, when I was on Brekkie Radio, we would do overseas broadcasts, and one of them was in Vietnam, and we were working with a crew called CBM, which do incredible work with eye operations. And one night, I ran into a friend of mine, Lucy, who is on air in Melbourne, and she had been cornered by a giant Russian man wearing gold hot pants and nothing else. And he was trying to coax her into his bedroom, which we were all like, yes, that is not happening. And so my buddy Kel, who's her co-host and now husband, was like, no, that's not happening. And so I stepped in as well, because I was like, oh, well, no, we want Lucy to be safe on this trip. So we were trying to convince him that's not going to happen. And so he said, well, why don't you guys all come in and start drinking with us? And so he went back into his room. And when he did that, we said, run loose, just get out of here. And he emerged again with like a 2-liter bottle of vodka and 3 shot glasses. And he's like, you must drink with me, and he couldn't speak anything but drink with me was all he could say. And we were like, okay, well, let's have a shot, And so we had a shot of this vodka, and it was like rocket fuel. And we were like, we are not going into the room to drink with this guy. So we said, why such small glasses? Like the glasses, they're too small. We want bigger glasses. And so he went back into the room.
Oh my God.
And when he did that, Kel ran and was like, Phoenix Rising, and took off. And I was like, yes, Phoenix Rising. And I started chasing him. And, this Russian in gold hot pants reemerged from the room, was like, no, and chasing after us. Anyway, we got away from him. And I finally asked him, why do you say Phoenix Rising? He says, oh, when there's, a catastrophe of events, it's like a phoenix rising from the ashes. And so we in our show adopted this idea of full phoenix rising, which was when we make a mistake and when we fall short of the mark and when we do something silly, there's an opportunity for redemption and rebirth. And so, like, if you know anything about the mythology around Phoenix, it rises from the ashes. And so I think, within scripture, we see this idea of death and rebirth a lot. And so we just kind of doubled down on it. And so I wanted to use that as a stepping stone to say that even, in our weakness and in our brokenness, God works in extraordinary ways. And there's an opportunity each and every day for this kind of Phoenix rising moment of rebirth.
Yeah.
So
Brilliant. I love that. And I love the backstory. It's something I did not expect at all.
Well, I'll tell you right now, mate, the guy, he would have been 6'4". He had hands like frying pans, and he was glistening. Like, I don't know if he had like coconut oil on his skin, but his skincare routine was incredible. But it was also a bit daunting when he's just wearing gold hot pants, and it's like, this scene is terrible and we don't want to be a part of it. And we're in northern Vietnam. So,
exactly.
Like, it's wild.
Anything could happen. It's super wild.
Yeah.
So sort of follow-up question then is, why did you think it was important to write this book? And what what's the hope in writing it that people who read it, what's the hope that the takeaway would be for them?
Yeah. So I one of the things I was really wrestling through, Caleb, is coming out of breakfast radio and going back into pastoral ministry. That all took place around COVID. And I think
Yeah.
COVID's culturally was this really significant shift in a lot of our lives and a lot of our experiences. Post-COVID, obviously, I think we had to deal with loss. We for many of us, we'd lost a year and a half of our lives through COVID 1 and 2. And there was also a shift seismically in the church, is that I think we moved away from this historic Methodist, Lutheran, and I use the term evangelical in the sense of like a pragmatic experience of the church, not in a Bible believing sense. Like, I don't think that's anything that we should ever divorce from our church experience. Like, we want to be Bible believing, but this entire structure for how we have done church for years and years and years and years that eventually found its home in like a church growth movement. And then like, even as you look at the expressions of modern mega church movements, was a very professional, polished experience. And then in this kind of moment of time, there was a shift where we seem to be moving. And, you know, I think Mark Sayers kind of doubles down on this term, but this idea of like liminality. So we were moving into a new season. And I think as part of that, my wrestle was, if it's not polish and it's not performative, our experience of church, then what does it look like if we look at the way Jesus led? And what I felt like as you kind of examine scripture was Jesus led slowly. He led humbly. He allowed his disciples to make mistakes and then teach them through those mistakes. And so, you know, if you were just to take a 50,000 foot perspective on Jesus's ministry over the 3 years that we have recorded in the Gospels, and you just said, okay, we're going to send the Son of God to earth, and we want him to have maximum impact. The way that Jesus comes into the world is not how your marketing department would do it. Do you know, like if I was in the heavenly marketing department and I said, okay, Jesus, entry in the world, and he goes, Virgin Mary, town of Bethlehem, I would be like, no. Caesar's in command, lightning bolt to the middle of Caesar's rule, massive explosions, army of angels,
Right.
Jesus fully formed, preferably like he's done chest day and arms day, big, bulky dude, like shock and awe.
Yeah.
And it's not how he operates. And he comes under the rule of Caesar. He comes into a place where it's not well known. They then try and execute all the babies, which they do. And he goes into hiding. And you go, all of this is how Christ Jesus chooses to enter and work through people. This is not a dominance thing. This is a proximity and relational thing.
Yeah.
And so that became the framework to say, well, what if church was a little bit more messy?
Yeah.
It was a little bit more slow. And we were okay with misfits, unreliable people who sit outside of the box, people who say, hey, I feel like I'm broken beyond use. And you can go, no, God redeems that. You're not late. You're in the perfect place at the perfect time. You're not a problem to be solved. You're a soul that is in the process of redemption. And those kind of places are where we can walk in real-time grace as opposed to retroactive grace. And, you know, one of the characters I use as an example for this is David. David wouldn't make the eldership team based on what he does with Bathsheba and Uriah. Like, we would immediately be like, we have to step this guy down from leadership. But God works through that. And so part of the conversation is, let's not glorify the sin, but also recognize that God is in the business of redeeming broken people, of which all of us are. And so that became the framework for saying, well, how does then grace proactively live out in our lives where we can kind of speak towards cancel culture fatigue, fear of public failure, move away from this kind of honor shame paradigm and into this reconciling paradigm where Christ is in the business of reconciliation, not honor and shame. And so that became the framework for the book.
Yeah, that's amazing. Just a quick clarifying question is, what do you mean by
Retroactive grace.
retroactive grace?
Yeah. So believers are really great at looking back and going, David, man, greatest king of Israel, walked with the Lord. The Lord built his everlasting line through the lineage of David. What a king. The absolute apex of Israel's rule. Okay. Yeah, he had some shortcomings. All of that happens retroactively because we look back through history with rose-tinted lenses. But in the moment, Nathan the prophet walks in and confronts him in his sin. He breaks down and weeps. And there's clear ramifications for his actions, but God doesn't step him down from leadership. In fact, God works through that, but there's clear new parameters for that. So even in the moment, if we were there, would we understand the same kind of grace and humility that we show towards him now? We do that with the disciples. You think on the day that Jesus dies on the cross, there are people who deny him to little kids. There's a little girl who, hey, aren't you one of Jesus's disciples? No, different guy, not me.
Right.
And then in that 40 days of resurrection ministry, what does Jesus do for the disciples while they're out fishing on a boat? He cooks them bread and fish, bacon and egg rolls, guys, come in.
Yeah.
And the question becomes, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. And there's this beautiful redemption for an individual who in Jesus's most significant moment, as he establishes this enduring and everlasting covenant through his own sacrifice of his life, denies him. And yet Peter is redeemed beautifully in kind of, what are we talking, like a chapter later? Like it's extraordinary. And so I think part of it is we read back into that and we're like, man, Peter, he's rocky. Like, what an incredible disciple. And you're like, yeah, but in the moment, there's some real significant failures. And Jesus doesn't shy away from them. He steps into it and he ministers in this beautiful, slow way to say, no, there's redemption for you, Peter.
Yeah, I do love that. And I think 100% agree with you in that the way Jesus steps into humanity is in this upside down way, right? He comes to serve, not to be served. He comes in a really ordinary fashion. Where I agree with you. It's like, well, if I was on the marketing team, it's just like, yeah, where's all the hype? Where's the sensationalism?
Yeah.
What controversy can we have in the lead up to sort of elevate him even more? But yeah, he comes in humility and he shows us what it looks like to lead. And while you're talking, I was reminded of when he washes his disciples' feet. I was actually just looking for the scripture in John 13, because it is something profound about. I'm just trying to find the exact verse, but he basically. Let me see if I can find it.
Is this where the disciples then step in and say, "Don't do this, Master"? Then wash our robes as well.
Yeah. They do that, but it's. I think the profound bit. I think in the NIV it says Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Yeah,
yep.
That's what it is. So Jesus knew that his Father had put all things under his power. So in that knowledge, then preceding that, he steps into washing his disciples' feet. So it's like this incredible juxtaposition where it's like Jesus knowing his power, knowing his authority, what does he choose to do with that next?
Yep.
And you expect like in terms of you'd expect something great, and in our line of what does leadership look like in this moment, like amazing speech, or just like captivates the room with his presence and his words. But he takes off his robe and kneels down and washes his disciples' feet. And it's just like, man, there's something countercultural. There's something upside down about that moment where Jesus, with power, takes what like all his authority, all his power, and chooses to use that to wash his disciples' feet.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, we're
Amazing.
talking about something that's relational, not performative, right? Is that Christ came to redeem people, not to put on a performance. And I think one of the extraordinary, and this is where the book kind of dovetails two ideas, which is this kind of chaotic experience of my own life and the funny things that have happened. But it's also the way that Christ leads, is that there's an embodied presence of our Lord and King. It feels a little chaotic, but there's clearly a plan there. He is about relationship, and he creates these extraordinary, memorable moments that for years and years and years and years, the disciples will be talking about that feet washing experience. The Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, for our final supper together, washed all our feet.
Yeah.
And those roads are dusty, man. You know, that's not a fun, like you're getting in there, there's some toe fungus.
Yeah.
You know, you're working in the gaps, you're getting those feet spotless.
If
That's a big
anyone
deal.
is from WA and's been up north and it's that red dirt, it's everywhere.
Gets everywhere.
It's hard to get rid of.
Yep.
So why do you think this is important to know, Duncan, in terms of like why are you so passionate about people understanding this reconciliation plan, this grace that Jesus gives people and breathes into people in perhaps the worst seasons of their life, where they've messed up, or even where they are a victim of a horrendous act? Like, why is this so important for people to understand?
Because I feel like in my experience walking with God, he meets me in the moment. Not when I'm impressive or not when I've got it all together, but when I'm alive. Do you know, like it's like the baseline is you've got a heartbeat and I can do something. And I think that that's the extraordinary thing about the way that I've seen God transformatively move in my life. It's not about me having it all together. It's not about me doing the right things. There's this beauty of encounter where, you know, the special moments of encountering Jesus often happen in the difficult, dark, hard seasons. You know, we often talk about enlightenment, which is this, you know, like I often think about enlightenment. This is not in the book, but I think about enlightenment through the lens of this kind of fluffy green fields, bright summer's day encounter with God where everything seems to be going well and suddenly you have a revelation. But a friend explained to me that there's a thing called endarkenment, which is in the misery and woe and savageness of life, there are opportunities to encounter God in real and powerful ways. And I think God meeting us at our worst is often the place where we hear God the most, and also speaks as a testimony to way more people than us when we've got it all together and life is good. You know, is that oftentimes it's the valley experiences that allow us to walk into mountaintop experiences. People want to hear that God works with messy, broken people, and he does. That's, you know, that's his, what is it? Modus operandi, you know, that's the way he works.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a beautiful picture. Have you heard of the book Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland, I think, or Gavin Ortland? One of the two.
One of the Ortlands.
One of the Ortlands, could have even been their father.
It might have been Ray, the dad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
might have.
Yeah.
But like what I really enjoyed the insight given because it was like, yeah, Jesus steps into our brokenness. Um, he doesn't. It sounds like what you're saying as well. It's like he doesn't judge. He doesn't like give us the cold shoulder or anything like that. But he chooses to enter in, and he is with us and helps us through it. He doesn't leave us in that place either. But it's this amazing like imagery of compassion. Like, what does it mean to suffer with someone?
Yeah.
That's what compassion is. Um, I think that's a beautiful thing. Do you see it playing out in churches? That's like how can we be Jesus to others?
Oh, mate, absolutely. Like, I think this has been one of the funny things. So I'm in a little movement of churches in Australia called Churches of Christ. And one of the things we've been passionate about for probably 50 years is spiritual formation. So if you know what spiritual formation is, brief background, there's a guy called Dallas Willard who's big on it. Another guy, Richard Foster, who writes a bunch on it. It comes out of the Desert Fathers, if we're going all the way back to kind of ancient monastic practices. And then more recently, you see Peter Scazzaro and then John Mark Comer are big on this idea of spiritual formation. But part of it is speaking to culture, is that, we have people who are incredibly time poor. We have people who feel digitally scattered. We have people who are craving healthy rhythms and not events. So, church moves away from performance and production to presence, which is the way that Jesus operates, and that we don't want to have these fancy, expensive spaces, but we want to have places where we feel like we're having sacred encounters. And I think what the undercurrent of all of that is this idea of spiritual formation is doing stuff for God was never the end game. Being with God is the end game. And what the challenge often is when we do like discipleship that lands with us requiring to do for God, we miss the richness and joy of being with God, which is what spiritual formation is about, is that there's a slowness. There's a recognition that internally stuff is happening in my life that I need to address internally, and then see the intersections of God and Jesus in my own life, and then through that minister out of the power of the Holy Spirit. And so one of the things that I think we're seeing in church is this deep desire to have, for want of an old school definition of a spiritual encounter with God and a mystical encounter with God. And I don't mean like a new age mysticism, but there's this deep longing in people that I think you're seeing in this quiet revival of a longing to encounter the fullness of God. And so that's what, I think is really exciting about this moment is people want to have deep encounters with God, but to do that, there has to be a velocity shift. This is not
What do you mean by that?
Think about how time poor we are in life. Phones, digital devices are dinging and ringing all around us. We've got calendars of events. We've got to get to the next thing. We often overextend ourselves. For many of us, as we record this podcast, Caleb, we're heading into a Christmas season. And so that means we're busy, time poor, lots is happening. I've got appointments after this and then appointments after the appointments. God doesn't operate like that. The fullness of God is available to everyone right now, but for you to encounter it, you have to encounter slow. So we have to create space, we have to create slow, and we have to disconnect from a velocity that our souls do not long for and find a new speed, which is a lot slower and a lot softer. And so it's not about the smoke machine on a Sunday and the Holy Spirit lights and a performance that is so well polished, there's no space for an encounter. But it is about creating a velocity for a person to walk out of the crazy of life
Mm.
to find a much slower, more spacious encounter with God where we can just sit and learn the ability to be with God as opposed to doing for God. And I think for a lot of people, that's really abrasive because we don't know how to do that. And I think what the shape of the future of church is to create those encounters and moments where we can slow and we do have permission just to sit and be,
Mm.
and then having to deal with, oh, hold on, my soul is screaming for some reason. It's like, yeah, it's not used to this, but it's okay. We'll
Right.
get there.
Yeah.
I didn't hear from God. That's okay. We can sit here and wait. It's okay.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have to answer us now. He's not some, dancing monkey who's doing it just because this is the first time we've done it. Is that sometimes it takes a while before we start to hear that still small voice of God.
Yeah. What would the like playing I really love spiritual formation, and I think it is a massive part of like our journey in being followers of Christ. Uh but what does it look like then to like enter into that space where you sort of I feel like there's something that needs to come beforehand, that you actually have to see that there's goodness to that. Um but then it's like, is that an individualistic or selfish thing, like saying, "Oh, this is something that's really good, so I want to do that." And I know that's not what you're saying, but it's like I want to sit still with God and just be with God because of how it makes me feel, as opposed to what I'm hearing you say is like who God is. Um, but maybe those things happen together, maybe not. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, listen, first of all, one of the things you're touching on is a key identifier for like a weakness within this idea, which is it's not all about you. Like I think one of the dangers is we can develop an obsession for this personal encounter with God. But I think as a person, you sit in with a community of believers who are called to have an encounter with God. And so we have to always learn not just to minister to our own souls, but learn the ability to look up to the horizon and go, actually, we're part of a greater narrative of encouraging one another until we see the day approaching. That idea that this has to be as part of a community. But I think what you speak to, first of all, has to start with permission. You have permission to go slow. That, there is a sense that you need to know you are chosen, that you are set apart, that you have been called to do good things that God has prepared in advance for you to do. And that is not predicated on you doing something, but it's God's choosiness, and that choosiness is really wide. It's for all of creation. And so you have a permission to actually go slow. You actually belong before you learn to behave. That's an old Andy Stanley quote, but I think it's really beautiful to have this idea that actually the invitation to someone to Christian community is often you belong before you behave. Like,
Mm.
one of the questions I asked in the book is, if Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, when did she stop sinning in her encounter with God? So she comes to know Jesus. We don't get a sense that she immediately gives up the profession. But maybe one of the journeys that we miss is that a lot of these people, whether they be tax collectors or fishermen or prostitutes, have to have permission to go on a journey.
Mm.
And I think the problem with that for a church, if we're looking for a sanitized experience of God, is that allowing people to belong before they behave is very messy.
Mm.
People mess up, and learning the ability to go, which I think God, Jesus does this really well with the woman at the well. Yeah, that's not your husband. Go away and sin no more. Is the initiation isn't, let me just identify all the sin in your life, but it's an awareness that man, this is not how you're called to live. And you know that. You know that in your heart of hearts. And you've had this extraordinary encounter with this, this Jesus character who is Lord of Lords, King of Kings. And he's calling you to something better.
Yeah,
And she accepts that invitation.
that's brilliant. A thought on that, Duncan, is so say, particularly in, I suppose, like church structures, is um, a- actually, I'd say most, even in family structures, is like culture flows down
Yes,
often.
agreed.
So yeah, so like just thinking, there's been, I think the knee jerk reaction within leadership that I've seen, at least from a public level, is that when there's a fall from grace or something like that, they're exposed, and then the church does this like sidestep from the person.
Yep.
And I think, like, I can understand why they're doing that, in the sense of like, oh, this looks really bad for us. We need to disassociate ourselves with them so that we can show the public facing presentation of us as like we're trying to do good by people. But it's actually counter to what you're saying, in the sense of like, well, there's an opportunity there for Jesus' reconciliation to actually um, be revealed to the world, and even to that church community, in saying like, this is what he does. Like, we're broken, we're broken people, and Jesus steps into that and heals. And so what does that look like in a church where, yeah, leaders obviously carry a lot of weight, the culture that they have flows down? How would you approach that situation? Or like, do you have thoughts around there?
Yeah, listen, I think there's this beautiful example especially in the Old Testament with David. So, sleeps with Bathsheba, kills Uriah, acts like nothing's wrong. Nathan the prophet confronts him in the story with this story about a lamb who's taken from a poor farmer. What would you do? And David is incensed.
Mm,
And then the revelation is you're the guy who took the lamb, and he is immediately broken by that. And
mm,
so the first thing that I would want to identify in that story is that there's a heartfelt, contrite response to I have sinned. Like,
right.
guilt kicks in. I have made a horrible decision. Yes, this is me. Against the Lord alone have I sinned, is
Mm,
the response of David. And the idea being is that, these are all God's people. And those God's people, the king of that is God. And so you have sinned against God in doing what you have done.
mm,
Heartfelt, contrite brokenness. So hey, man, yeah, you're right. And an acknowledgement of what I've done wrong. The second thing is that, like, and this is there's an old book called Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. But there's a clear response for reconciliation where, through Nathan, certain things now have to shift.
mm,
Spirit of God has been removed from you. That's going to someone else. There is now going to be enmity in your family. Like, there are some significant things that happen as a result of your actions. So
mm.
there is like David's in heaven. We're going to go and meet David.
Right.
So there is a liberation of the eternal weight of his sin that comes through ultimately Christ Jesus. But in that moment, the covenantal promises that there's an eternal kingdom that's going to be established with David. But there are also consequences for his actions. And I think you can't divorce the two. Yeah, you're redeemed. The ultimate example of this is you might have to do prison ministry on the inside, but you are saved by the blood of Jesus. So there are consequences for real and significant sin that may be a judicial punishment that happens. It may be a stepping down of leadership, but you are now not completely excluded from the kingdom, you're just now doing ministry in a different place. And I think that's a really important part of the dialogue. So I don't think the right response is, as you know, like to your example, a church leader makes a gross and negligent decision that is ultimately very costly and maybe profoundly traumatic to a number of people within the church. We don't turn around and say he's forgiven by Christ Jesus. Let's put him back in the driving seat.
Yeah.
But there needs to be a movement towards a reconcile. What does reconciliation look like? Because what we do is honor and shame. You know, I think, and again, Caleb, I've forgotten his name, but the lead pastor who was at Hillsong, New York City, has
Carl Lentz.
Yeah, Carl Lentz, right, has this falling out. But if you kind of follow him on socials, there's now this kind of reintegration of him within Christian narrative in a very different context, in a very different way, with a really deep sense of acknowledgement of, hey man, I'm messed up in big and real ways. And you can chart this with all the way back to there's a book by a famous 80s evangelist, Jim Baker, where it's called I Am Wrong, because he got called out for a bunch of sin in his life and wrote a book about it. Right. Is that we see these guys who are, they're reconciled to a preferred tomorrow, which, by the way, is a representation of the difference between where it starts in a garden and it finishes in a city. God reconciles Israel not back to Eden, but forward to Zion. And so I think with leadership, when we see it in church, we can't reconcile them back to what they were, but we can reconcile them to something new tomorrow. And it may not be in our community at that particular church, but there is a larger community of believers that we can do this for. You know, Mark Driscoll is running a successful ministry in Phoenix, Arizona. I don't think he was ever going to do that in Seattle again. That might be wrong. That might be right. I don't know. But at least we're reconciling something. It's messy and there's still a lot of hurt associated with it. But we've got to love people. We've got to love our enemies. And that's where we can be a demonstration of Christ Jesus to our world, is when we learn to love our enemies, and there may be boundaries associated with that. So
Right. Yeah. And I think even within those two examples you gave, like, the difficulty in those is, like, for someone listening or who know those examples, is like potentially whatever those reconciliations look like and the extent of their genuineness, they happened outside of the community they're a part of. So,
Yep.
which is a sad, I find that, like, oh, that's discouraging. Like, here we have the church who Jesus so dearly loves and died for her, and says he's coming back for his bride, and has given us the church as a part of, we talked about spiritual formation before, like community is essential in spiritual formation.
Yeah.
So you'd think that the church should, like, envelop this brokenness within themselves, but it's sad when and like potentially there's obviously two parties involved, but it's like it's sad when the church, when they find reconciliation outside of the church. There's always a question mark, like, oh, why couldn't that happen in the church that they're going to? Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I would just expand your definition to say that, you know, like locally here, we've got instances of pastors who have made bonehead decisions in their own churches. They're at a different local church where they're a part of the ministry there and doing great things. But because of the hurt associated with that smaller community, they had to find home in a larger Catholic church, so the universal church,
Right.
where they could minister again. And I think part of that would be to say, yeah, sometimes people just can't get over the hurt. Like we have an example in the New Testament between, was it Paul and John Mark, where a sharp dispute arose and they had to go their separate ways. So they minister in different places. Now, as you continue to read the story, at some stage they come back together and do ministry together. But for a season, they had to be apart. And so I think that one of the beauties, and I've been reading a lot of books this year, Caleb, on revival, because I feel like we're seeing the murmurs of that. And part of the murmurs that come before revival is a deep desire for prayerfulness. And I think with, 24/7 prayer movement, people who use Lectio Divina, like we're getting passionate about prayer. But the other thing that happens is this radical unity between denominations. Is that like when we start to see the denominational walls fall and churches within communities, and I mean close together in communities where Baptists, Anglicans, AOGs, Churches of Christ, Presbyterians, Unitings, Catholics are meeting together, praying together, and see themselves functioning as a church with various different communities, then I think when you have those moments of hurt and pain, you go, hey, listen, I have to give this guy a call, just give him a heads up. But that might be the place where you need to heal.
Yeah.
Is you're still in the church. It just has to be over there while the pain and the trauma of what has happened here, it gives permission for it to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that if it's not done in that way, because there's transparency and openness and vulnerability in that example,
Yeah.
that process that you just said, I think if there's a lack of transparency and someone just leaves, uh, I think the question is like, have they truly been reconciled? But then also, if they are, it's like it's almost robbed the congregation of seeing the work of God and participating in that reconciliations. So I think it is twofold. It's like God's doing a work in that broken person,
Yep.
but then God's also doing a work in the congregation or in the community they're a part of to be in a similar fashion to say, okay, we trust in you, God. Let's look to you to see how this is done, and it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard, but like our trust is in you, not in ourselves. So it's just like, I wonder if it's not done like transparently and not done with people in mind, and someone just leaves, then it potentially like robs the church of that spiritual formation within themselves as well. And just seeing the beauty of like, this is the story. This is what we're a part of. We're broken, but because of Jesus, we can be healed, and what that looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned what was it? There was something that you said that I was like, I want to get your thoughts more on that, and now it's just just jumped out of my mind.
I'm sorry, mate. I've got verbal diarrhea.
No,
I say a
that's
lot.
fine. But we're talking about messiness anyway, and
Yeah.
failures. And I know you said I could ask you this. So what's one of your biggest fails in like when you look at the amalgamation of your life and where you're at now? And yeah, like what's so that's the one side, and then how has God, with what we're talking about, how has he reconciled you in that space or out coming through that?
Yeah. Listen, I think the fail that kind of jumps to mind is I was part of this really extraordinary church in Phoenix, Arizona. As part of that, they had a really strong church planting movement with a crew called Converge. So our church, Church of Celebration, still a vibrant ministry in Phoenix, Arizona. We went from 100 people to, I think when we left, almost 1,300 people.
So
And
you lived in the US?
for 5 years, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, both my kids were born in Phoenix, Arizona. It's out.
Right.
Mate, I support Phoenix. I support the Arizona Cardinals. I support the Arizona Diamondbacks. I'm a mad Phoenix fan.
Yeah. There you go. Right around the corner from Driscoll.
Yeah. Well, so I was just leaving as he was moving into town.
Yeah. Okay.
And part of that was, I think, watching the pastors figuring out a way to reconcile this guy back into ministry, but also acknowledging there's a lot of hurt associated with that.
Yeah.
But
Side note is, sorry, I'll let you
yeah,
carry
go for
on.
it.
I'm just, no, I was like, oh, 'cause my brother and sister-in-law lived in Phoenix for a while, and we went and visited them because my wife's from America, so we went and visited them while we were over there, and
Yeah.
it was just as Driscoll was coming into, I think it's called Trinity or
Trinity
something like
Church.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we went and visited that because I was curious. I'm curious about this conversation, and like I was like, wow, like his early work really impacted my life, like it did so many others.
Oh,
And I'm
yeah.
like, oh,
Confessions of a Reformation Reverend was a book that got me into church planning and moved me to Phoenix.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So I was very curious, but then it was like, oh, if I'd known you at the time, I would have come and said hi. But yeah,
Appreciate that, man.
paths aligned later on.
Yeah.
So yeah, carry on.
Yeah, so we got to this place after being there for about 5 years where we felt the call to church plant, and I was getting invitations to join other churches and other ministries in Phoenix. And we really kind of doubled down and said, no, we're going to go back to Australia to plant a church. That's where we feel called to do that. And so went through a whole bunch of different church planting assessments and then moved back to Australia, to the area that I live in now, actually, and attempted to plant a church called Mission Church. When we launched Mission Church, the church that we had agreed to partner with out of the States, the senior pastor there was stood down for a whole bunch of failures in his own leadership, which meant that all our resourcing and support dried up immediately. At the same time, my father got cancer really bad, and we had no funding. My dad was very ill, and we were attempting to plant in a very, 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 very different context to what we were doing in Phoenix. And for a year and a half, just couldn't get over the hump. And for our last Sunday, we booked a band called City of Light, which are kind of a big worship band here in Sydney. And they came and played to 3 people in a community hall in the area I was in. Wow. And I was so petrified, mate, of failing because we had had so much success in Phoenix. Like we went from 100 people to 1,300 people. We went from 100 to 600 in 6 weeks. Like we were baptizing 50 people a week in the middle of the global financial crisis. And people were just shattered, lost everything. And we would just speak the love of Jesus and they would be radically transformed. When we got back to Sydney, everyone was rich, doing well, did not care, was not interested. This is not something we want to be a part of. And I had this beautiful community. Honestly, it was about 6 people who I'm still friends with today. And we just kind of sat down as a team and said, this is not going to work. And so I was, I think I was 34 and a half years old. And we closed the door on the church. I paid this band a significant chunk of change to come and play to like between 3 and 6 people, most of who were my family. Wow. And we shut the doors. And I think the thing about the failure for me was there was stuff that I could have done, but there was so much that sat outside of the realm of my control. And it didn't matter how much gifting or how much talent I had, the wheels were going to fall off. The thing was going to be a catastrophic fail, and I had no way of controlling that. And I really distinctly felt like God was like, yeah, I'm not going to let it work. And you're going to have to learn to deal with that. And this is going to sit on your resume as the great church planning fail of your life, that you could have taken a job in a mega church in Phoenix and been on a cushy salary, but you chose to come out here because you believed that God was at work. And by the way, I was at work in this, but the thing that I was at work was teaching you through failure that you are still a child of God, that you are still deeply beloved, that you still have plans, that I still have plans and purposes for you, and that I can do a good thing through this. And I think as part of that, I had a real wrestle because I think when I came back to Australia, I was like, yeah, man, no, I've had success in the States and I'm great at this. And I'm going to crush it here. You guys need to just shut up and get out of my way because we're going to do this. And God was like, no, you got the wrong attitude. It's not about you. It's about me. This is my church. This is my bride. These are my people. And so for me, it was this huge lesson in humility. Like your arrogance and your pride is not welcomed. And this is just going to be a really humbling experience. And the funny thing is I met failure. It wasn't nearly as intimidating as I thought. And there was plenty of beauty to be learned from that. And if you think that God is always calling you up and to the right, and he calls you down and to the right, and I mean like down into a lowly spot, that's probably a God thing. And if your life is always moving up and to the right, you're probably doing capitalism and not Christianity. And so for me, there was a huge wrestle about, like I didn't like being back in Australia. I didn't like that my family was really happy to be back in Australia. I wanted to be back in the USA. I felt like that's where I was successful, was in the USA, and I was a complete failure here. But if I didn't have that experience of like just colossal incompetent failure, then I wouldn't have had a kind of a revelation of the heart that would allow me to step into a breakfast radio gig where you are kind of, it's egocentric. And so I had to learn to get to a place of humility so I could be in a place which was going to be about my ego in a way that didn't completely derail me as a faithful follower of Jesus.
Yeah. Do you think that you could have learned that lesson another way? Or do you think...
Oh, no,
God's
I'm pig-headed.
providence-
No. Caleb, the more time you spend with me, I have very strong opinions, and then it's usually God stepping in and going, moron, let me show you why this is stupid.
Right.
And then I have the lesson and I'm like, oh yeah, no, he was right. That was silly. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a deep sense of self-awareness there to be able to answer that in that way. That's like, yeah, I don't think I could have learned it any other way.
Yeah.
I think that like that was God in his goodness, in his providence, and that led me to learn this lesson and to put my trust in him and not in my ego.
I think there's multiple phases of failure. Okay.
Right.
So when you're, and I'm talking to anyone who's teenager and down, you don't know what failure is. I mean, you've done stupid stuff, but you don't really understand what failure is. Usually it's just, you don't know better. So it's a naivety, ignorance thing.
Yeah.
In your 20s, you could probably point to a moment of failure, but it was completely predicated on your own actions. So something failed in your life, but you can clearly go, this was the reason why it didn't happen, and it was because I didn't do this thing.
Yeah.
In your 30s, for the first time, you have a failure that is completely predicated outside of anything that you could have done. Right. And now you have a real wrestle because you're like, you can't point to the thing that you could have done differently to make it work. And God in that moment is trying to shape you. In your 40s, it happens regularly where you go, I couldn't have done anything different, I don't think. And it's not because you're now getting comfortable with failure, but you're actually learning that there's a whole bunch that sits outside of your own control that you have no authority over. And you have to learn to release that to God and do the things that you can do well. And sometimes you look at a moment and go, oh man, I think I did the best I could. Right. And it didn't work. And that's okay. God is teaching me something in it. I don't know what it is yet. And maybe I'm feeling a little cranky about that. And that's also probably because you've got kids and you've got a wife and they're doing stuff and you're like, I got no control over them. So you're just practicing grace. And my guess is as I turn, into my 50s and in my 60s and into my 70s, that muscle of grace gets worked out a whole bunch more because I've got less power, less authority, less influence. And I'm just learning to come alongside of people in grace and humility and speak wisdom where I'm allowed to. And so oftentimes I feel like those are the differences between people. Someone's like, oh, I didn't make the basketball team because I didn't work out enough. It's like, that's a classic 20-something response. 40-something response is, oh man, which failure do you want to talk about? Because I've got a bunch in my life and it's about the lessons.
Your limitations.
Yeah.
Your extent of humanity. So it's like, I can't really look elsewhere other than this is my own doing.
Yeah. Someone said, what do you see as your limitations? And I said to him, I think I'm an exotic fast car, a Ferrari. and I can just run at top revs all the time. And what I've learned is I'm not. I have the capacity to be a drag car. So for exactly 10 seconds, I can run faster than anyone could possibly imagine. But at the end of that, you have to put me on a trailer, drive me home, and leave me in the garage for about a month. Alternatively, what I am like is a Corolla. And I have a pretty poor top speed, but I'm reliable and I can keep chuffing along and doing about 250,000 kilometers. And everyone's like, oh man, that old Corolla's still going.
Right.
And you got a choice. Do you want the drag car, which needs a rest at the end? Or do you want the Corolla that you're frustrated that isn't moving nearly as fast as you hoped it would?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Duncan, something I do with our guests is I'll ask our previous guests a question that they have for our next guest.
Yeah.
So I'll ask you in a second what your question would be. I had a conversation with two people. So you have two questions coming your way.
Okay.
The first one is, what is the first one? Let me find it. What advice would you give to your 18-year-old self?
Do Pilates and stretch more. Thanks. My back sucks. Yeah.
That is brilliant.
Work on
I
your
don't-
core strength and flexibility.
Yeah, I love that. It's a lesson that everyone learns when they hit 30. You realize, wow, stretching is actually a really important part of just functioning in your everyday life.
Yes. It's probably not spiritual enough, but really your body is a temple and you have to look after the foundations.
Yeah, well, that's what came to your head. So I love it. I love that response. The second question is, think of your top 5 cities in the world that you could live in. And then the first part of that is, which of those top 5 would you live in, given your current circumstances?
Okay.
So it's like, given your wage, the skills you have. Yeah.
So list the top 5 and then which
Yeah,
one of the top 5 I'd live in.
Yeah. And if you can't list 5, go for 3. But yeah.
Okay. Do they have to be in order?
No.
Okay. So I'll just list the top 5 cities and then I'll give
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
one that I
list
would.
the top. Yeah.
Sydney,
Mm-hmm.
Phoenix, Arizona,
Great place.
San Diego,
Mm.
Meguru in Japan.
Hmm.
Where are we at now? That's 4. So
Cool.
I've got to give you one more. I think I would go Melbourne.
Melbourne. Okay, cool.
I'm building a bridge between this Sydney-Melbourne divide.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So out of those 5, where would you actually, I'm going to cut it into two parts. Where would you, money, skills, not a question. You could just move into any of those cities now, even though you're currently in one of them. Where would you be?
I think my heart longs for Phoenix, Arizona.
Yeah.
I know that my family's heart does not long for Phoenix, Arizona. So I think
Right.
if you could magically transform their hearts, then I would be receptive to the opportunity.
Okay. Great. That's super interesting. Phoenix is a great place. It's got a Perth vibe to it
Yes.
in the sense of like, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just people are more outdoorsy and that sort of thing. But then obviously it's not by the ocean, so it's got all the cactuses. Great
Yeah.
hiking and things
Sunsets
like that.
are
Yeah.
incredible.
Beautiful weather. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So given your current circumstances and the skills you have and your limitations with family, where would you choose
Sydney.
to be? Sydney. Great. That was an easy one.
I love Sydney.
So sort of set you up for that one. So what would the question you would have for our next guest?
If you could make one, I'm just trying to word this right.
Yeah.
But if you could make one point with all your heart, scream it from a mountaintop, and it was the only point that you could make about God, about Jesus, about your relationship with God and Jesus, what would be the one thing that you would want the entire world to know?
Brilliant. That's a great question. And I'm sure the response isn't going to be Pilates, but it may be. I'm not too sure. We'll have to.
The good Lord works on your core better than any Pilates class will ever do.
I love that. Duncan, thanks so much for your time and just opening up a bit about your life and your work that you've done in your book, Full Phoenix Rising. If people are interested in finding out a bit more about yourself or what you do, or grabbing a copy of your book, where would you direct them to?
I got a website, duncanrobinson.net. I have an Instagram handle, which is also my gamer tag, Ultra Robo, and I'm not updating it. I don't care how professional I ever get. It's always going to be Ultra Robo. And then my church is Northgate, which is just northgate.org.au. Yeah.
Awesome. And I can put that up in the episode caption as well so people can find it easier.
Champion.
Thanks so much for the conversation, Duncan. Really enjoyed chatting to you once again.
Appreciate it, Caleb.